Hello there. I am about to go live with Equality Now. So just hang on a second. I am getting on with Kate Kelly. Waiting to get set up. Oh, it's such a strange thing.
Hi.
Hello!
Hi.
How are you?
So good, it worked.
Yay! Technology.
Hurrah.
Great. Well, let's not waste any time. Might as well get started. So basically, I've never done Instagram Live. This is kind of weird. But for those of you watching, this is Kate Kelly. She is a lawyer with Equality Now. Do you want to give them a brief bio real quick?
Yeah, hey everybody. My name is Kate and I am a human rights lawyer. I work for Equality Now, which is a women's rights organization, and we work on the rights of women and girls all around the world. I specifically focus on the United States. So a lot of people don't know that the human rights of women and girls are being violated right here in our country. But I work on a lot of different issues, and one of them is constitutional equality.
All right, and that's what we're here to talk about, basically. So I'm sure everybody is, or some of you are in your homes right now, and we're hanging out. And so we've been talking a lot about COVID and how women are really at the front lines of this virus, and they can be some of the most vulnerable people affected because they are usually caregivers and nurses, and I think it's like 70% of healthcare workers are women, but I think that's globally. And so we wanted to talk about the ERA is the Equal Rights Amendment. And the reason it's important is because it's trying to establish equality for women. So can you tell us a little bit about why the ERA is important, especially now, and why it's sort of a heightened topic, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, we're all in a period of a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of ways in which, like you said, women are disproportionately impacted by times of crisis. And a lot of those things have to do with stuff that happened a long time ago. So the reason that women are so disproportionately or negatively impacted now is women take have the huge part of the burden of raising and caring for children. And there aren't sort of government programs, or there isn't a way to be supported in that. Women earn less. So we just passed the Equal Pay Day. Equal Pay Day is the time in the month, or sorry, the time in the year that women catch up to men to earning the same as men. So it takes a whole year for men to earn that much money, and then it takes all the way until this time in the spring for women to catch up. So women make less, they earn less, and they have fewer protections in the law. And all of that kind of adds up to a point when we get to this place, when we get to a time of crisis, and women have been so systematically disadvantaged that all of these types of things really disproportionately impact us. And there, like you said, there are a lot of things, particularly in a time of crisis, like domestic violence is a good example, or I guess a bad example, that illustrates the point that women are really vulnerable in a time of crisis, and there aren't enough laws to protect women against domestic violence, and there isn't enough support in place to help them get out of those situations. So really, really briefly, the Equal Rights Amendment is an amendment to the US Constitution. So our most basic law is our Constitution. We all learn about it in school. But one thing that most people don't learn very much about, even in law school, I went to law school and I didn't learn very much about this, is that women are not equal in our Constitution. Women are not included in our Constitution, and there is no provision that protects us from discrimination on the basis of sex in our Constitution, and we need to change that.
Great. I agree. And so if we're talking about I know that the ERA, for those who don't really know, it was proposed. And the reason also we're talking about, if you are interested and you're watching, there is a great podcast hosted by Kate, and it's called Ordinary Equality. So you can check that out on wherever you get your podcasts, and you can learn more about it in depth, because it's a pretty intense and complicated topic, but it's also really, really important. So the podcast sort of walks you through it, and our conversation is just sort of to introduce all of you to what's going on. But so can you give us a brief history of the ERA and where it's at right now?
Yeah, so if you like what we're talking about and you want to learn more, like AnnaSophia said, check out Ordinary Equality. It's produced by a great women-led company called Wonder Media Network, and they do a great job of putting the podcast together. I'm just the humble host, and I put the content together, but they make it really interesting and fun as constitutional law can be. I think it's fun.
It can be fun, yeah.
I'm like, it's fascinating, everyone. This is a wild ride. So the Equal Rights Amendment was actually written and first introduced in 1923. So that was almost 100 years ago. It was introduced by a woman named Alice Paul. And there's a whole episode about her and the podcast and why she's important to getting women the vote. And also she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. So they proposed it in 1923. Why is it 2020 and we don't have it yet? Why is it not part of the Constitution? Well, a lot has happened since then, but it was passed in Congress in 1972. So there was this huge wave of the women's movement. There's women marching in the streets. Women are demanding all sorts of things. And one of the main pieces of legislation they wanted, one of the main asks of the women's movement of the 1970s, was the Equal Rights Amendment. So this woman wrote it in 1923. It was brought up in Congress every year until 1972. It passes in both houses of Congress. It was on the platform of both the Republican and the Democratic parties at the time. It was wildly popular.
And this is like the time of Gloria Steinem and the Year of the Woman. This is like when women's lib was sort of like at its height.
Of course, yeah. It was Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm, and all of these incredible women are marching in the streets and they're burning their bras. Actually, they didn't burn their bras. That was a myth, but that's the time. And so women are demanding that we change the Constitution, that we put us into the Constitution, and that's the Equal Rights Amendment. So it passed, but under the Constitution, an amendment also has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that's like a really big deal. That's hard. It has to pass in both houses of Congress, which it did, and then it has to go to all the state legislatures, and they all have to ratify it as well. So immediately when it passed, it got ratified right away by a lot of states. Hawaii actually it ratified it the same day that it passed in the Senate because of the time difference. So they passed it in DC, and it was a bunch of hours earlier in Hawaii. So they passed it the very same day. It had all this momentum. Towards the end of the 1970s, it got to the states that were harder. So it got to states that don't have as much infrastructure for women's rights. It got to states that are a lot more conservative, and it slowed down. There was a woman, her name is Phyllis Schlafly, and she's sort of like the anti-hero of the 1970s ERA movement.
And there's the show on FX that's coming out, Mrs. America, that's very excited about. And that'll talk about it. If you guys are interested in this and you're looking for a show to enjoy during this quarantine time.
Yeah. So it's on Hulu, so you can stream it on Hulu. It's airing on April 15th. We don't work for the show. We're just excited about it.
That's why I'm just a fan.
But Kate Blanchett is actually going to play this woman we're talking about, Phyllis Schlafly, which is going to be incredible. Like everything about my life is going to be coming into one zenith. I'm very, very excited. So Kate Blanchett is going to play this woman, Phyllis Schlafly, who fought against the Equal Rights Amendment. So a woman who sort of led the charge to stop these states from ratifying and keeping it out of the Constitution. So we can talk a lot about Phyllis.
I guess I want to sort of move the conversation for
Yeah.
people who are wondering, like, okay, well, why is the ERA, why is it necessarily important today? Like, if you're at home and you feel that you are equal, which I mean, I was raised to believe that I am equal, but there's an episode in the podcast that says that, and you call it equality is not a feeling.
Yeah.
And so it's basically like, if I'm learning what the ERA is right now, and I'm wondering, like, well, what this ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, what will it do for me? I thought we were equal. I thought in the 14th Amendment we are equal, and don't we? Precedents are usually set through the courts and winning courts. So why do an amendment? What would happen if this was passed?
Yeah, so
Sorry, that was a lot of questions.
no, it's good. So Phyllis, to keep that story short, and if you want to know more, listen to the podcast, Ordinary Equality. But Phyllis kept it out of the Constitution and the movement. And part of the reason they resisted it were a lot of scare tactics that happened at the time. So they said, women would have to be drafted if we had the Equal Rights Amendment. They said it would cause same-sex marriage. That was a big point against it. They said that women, that it would cause reproductive rights to be a constitutional right. They said that women would lose benefits. So they had a movement called Stop
These all
ERA.
seem like really great things if that's your angle.
Right, yeah. And now we know all those things are moot. So like, we have marriage equality across the United States without the Equal Rights Amendment. Women already serve on the front lines of the military, and the Pentagon has already recommended that women be eligible for the draft, which is scary in and of its own right, but it didn't take the Equal Rights Amendment for that to happen. So we don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. And to your point, why does it matter? I think it's important to understand that those are two separate concepts. So we are equal. Men and women are equal. We know that in our minds. We know that inherently that we can do anything that men can do. We have an internal sense that men and women are equal, and that's true. That's right. I don't want to discourage anyone. I know that I am equal and that I can do anything a man can do. The problem is we're not recognized as equals under the law, and those are different. And so some women, especially women with particular amount of privilege, say, I feel equal. I think I can do anything a man can do. Well, that's actually different, and under the law, you're treated differently. So that's actually just factually not true.
Can you give some examples for people?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really easy when you look at like the highest branches of our government. So we've never had a woman president. There are only 4 women ever who have served on the Supreme Court. Right now, even after this huge women's wave and like lots of women being elected to Congress, there's only 24%. So over 75% of our Congress currently is male. And then also that's also true of state legislatures. So there's only one state legislature in the entire United States of America that is majority female. That's actually Nevada. And so all of the rest of state legislatures have less women. So you can kind of look at the highest stratosphere of society, and that also Fortune 500 companies, boards, all of these different things. There's very few women. And the reason that exists is we're treated differently under the law, and we're also marginalized in our society. So even if you're wealthy and educated and white and you have all this privilege and you feel like I'm pretty set, I feel like there's nothing impeding me, that unfortunately is not true. And if you make it to one of these Fortune 500 companies and you're a partner in a law firm, you're still going to make less than the men who are similarly situated. So unfortunately, no matter how high you rise in our society, you're still going to be treated unequally. And that's also true under the law. So you mentioned the 14th Amendment, which a lot of people know about. or have heard about. The 14th Amendment it has what's called the Equal Protection Clause. So that's kind of, if you know RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and you've watched the movies about her, and she's this amazing pioneering lawyer who sort of, was also really nerdy. So she used her legal knowledge to try to get women protected under the Constitution. And she did that. In the 1970s, she litigated a lot of cases that kind of established that this Equal Protection Clause also applies to discrimination on the basis of sex, or it applies to women. The problem with that is that what she established a standard, but the standard is less than the standard that applies to other categories of discrimination. So if you're discriminated against on the basis of race, or religion, or national origin, these other categories get a higher standard. It's sort of this complicated standard system, but really what that means is,
think of it as like the gold standard versus
yes,
silver or bronze. Something.
So discrimination on the basis of race gets the gold standard, and it should. Discrimination on the basis of race is wrong. But discrimination on the basis of sex gets a lesser standard, and you're less likely to be successful if you bring a case on the basis of sex than you are
in terms of winning the case.
Yeah.
So could you give us an example of a case, or perhaps domestic violence, or Title IX, or in terms of human trafficking, or why it's important to get this? Because for people who don't really know, like if there's precedents are set in terms of our law through the court system. So they'll be argued, and then they argue it based on, I believe, an amendment. And so it's sort of like which is a law, and it's strict. But because equality is not in the Constitution, you kind of have to go a roundabout way through it. So by passing ERA, we would have a stronger sort of like law to cling to, so that it's the gold standard. So it always passes rather than being a little bit murky.
And it's also permanent. So if we put the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution, and it's very short, it's, the main clause is just 24 words. I'm actually wearing a t-shirt right now. So this is the Equal Rights Amendment. It fits on a t-shirt. Equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or any state on account of sex. Simple, straightforward. It's so simple that it encompasses a lot. But exactly what you're saying is true, that right now, the way that things are interpreted are up to judicial interpretation. They have to kind of squeeze it in under another category that was not originally designed to include gender. So the 14th Amendment was explicitly following the war and when they ended slavery. And so the 14th Amendment was specifically designed to prohibit discrimination on the basis of race. That's what it was made for. It was not made originally to include discrimination on the basis of sex. That was kind of like weaseled in through different judicial interpretation. And thank God to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who participated and helped really advance that standard. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg has said continually since the very beginning, she wrote a law review article in the early 1970s saying we needed an Equal Rights Amendment. She said if there's anything that she would change about the Constitution, she said this, a couple weeks ago, that it would be to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment and put the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution, because she never quite achieved that gold standard that you were talking about.
Right. But so coming up to that, the ERA doesn't see, it's not, I'd imagine a lot of people who are listening are like, I've never heard of that before, or it's mentioned, but it's mentioned maybe a couple times. And so it's kind of, it was sort of at its height in the 70s, it sort of dwindled down. Equality cases have been won through the courts. But now, so there's some criticism surrounding the ERA, and RBG came out with an article, or I think it was an interview at Georgetown Law. So what are the main criticisms of the ERA, and what are your main, what are sort of the pros and cons that people are discussing right now?
Yeah. And I forgot to answer your previous question, which was a concrete example of VAWA. So let me answer that first. I apologize. So I think one example that we talked about, and that's particularly relevant in this time of COVID, is violence against women. So there, if you listen to the podcast, I use an example of a woman who her children, she had a protective order against her former spouse, and her children were abducted by him and actually murdered by him. And she repeatedly called the police in order to get this protective order enforced. She begged them to intervene, and they would not enforce the protective order. So she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that she does not.
Can you tell people in case they want to look it up?
Yeah. So it's Jessica Lenahan Gonzalez versus the United States. So if you want to look up that case, so her name is Jessica Lenahan, and her former spouse's last name was Gonzalez. And so if you look up that case, it's actually a case against the police because she wanted the police to enforce this protective order. You know, what's the point of having it if they're not going to enforce it? Essentially, in a very short explanation, and again, I talk more about this in the podcast if you're interested, and I interview Jessica. The Supreme Court decided against her. The Supreme Court said that she does not, and that she cannot enforce this protection order. Well, the part of the reason that we can't get strong laws on the books to protect women against domestic violence, against sexual harassment, against all these things, is we don't have an anchor in the Constitution. So we talked about taking your case to the court, but then there's also another way to make laws, which is lawmakers, you know, the people we elect and go to Congress to make laws. A lot of them who want to pass laws to protect women say they just really don't have the way. They don't have an anchor in the Constitution or a way to pass laws that specifically protect women on the federal level. So if you talk to people like Carolyn Maloney, who's a representative from where I'm from here in New York.
Yes, I know her.
She's so wonderful.
Yeah.
So Carolyn Maloney focuses a lot on trafficking, on female genital mutilation, on violence against women. She's also been one of the strongest proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment, has brought it up every year since she's been in Congress in the early 90s. You know, year after year after year, she's bringing it up, and finally it's getting some traction. But she says the reason she knew that she needed the Equal Rights Amendment in the 90s is they kept trying to pass these laws. They kept trying to pass laws like the Private Remedy in the Violence Against Women Act, and they could not get it. They kept being overturned because we do not have an Equal Rights Amendment. It was stopping her from passing laws to protect women. I think the common arguments now, so like we talked about before, you know, women are already in the military, that argument is dead. Same-sex marriage already happened, so we have marriage equality, that argument is dead. A lot of the old arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s are now just moot. They're not relevant anymore. Right. But a lot of the opponents to the Equal Rights Amendment talk about primarily about things that they want to take away. So one of those is reproductive rights. We already have access to reproductive rights. Roe versus Wade decided that in 1973. Well, they actually want to take that away. And they're afraid that passing the Equal Rights Amendment will keep us.
When you're saying they?
The anti-ERA movement. That's largely comprised of sort of really conservative groups who are using this state-by-state strategy to kind of strip away women's rights. Another argument that I hear a lot is trans rights. So folks who do not acknowledge that trans people have rights and don't want trans people to be recognized under our law, they oppose the Equal Rights Amendment. And so because again, on my t-shirt, it says on the basis of sex. So the word women or woman is actually not in the Equal Rights Amendment as it was written in the 1920s. And so they think, and they're correct in thinking, that it will also protect trans people and non-binary people and sort of all marginalized genders. So that's actually, I agree with that. That's true. We just disagree on whether that's good or bad.
Right.
I think it's good. And I want trans people to be protected. People who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment do not want trans people to be protected.
Got it. And then So if the ERA is ratified, what will that mean? I think we were talking about um, the domestic violence case. We're also talking about Title IX, and we're also talking about FGM, and how that if the ERA was passed, how that would sort of help um, protect, like why it's been struck down in certain scenarios.
Yeah, so the female genital mutilation law is a good example. Female genital mutilation is a practice that is obvious in the name. What happens, but there is a federal law actually. Carolyn Maloney and some of these other folks in the 1990s actually did get a law banning female genital mutilation in the United States. That law, unfortunately, last year was struck down by a district court judge who said that it's unconstitutional. It's not that it's right. It's not that people should do it. It's just that the Congress does not have the right under the Constitution to pass that law. He said.
And did he say that based on religion, or what was the reason to strike it down?
So he struck it down because it doesn't have enough to do with interstate commerce. So there are only certain things. So the Constitution is this document, and these dudes who wrote the Constitution in the beginning were like, okay, who gets to do what? What does the federal government get to do, and what do the state governments get to do? And they said, okay, the federal government only gets to do certain things. And that limits the power of the federal government. Everything else we're going to leave up to the states, because there were so many different states, and there were, different states with very, very, very different approaches. So they said, okay, most of the stuff we're going to leave up to the state, and the federal government can do this, X, Y, and Z. The main thing that the federal government gets to do is obviously regulate commerce between states. So, we have a federalist system, and we're a whole country. And so some people live in Maryland, and some people live in Oklahoma, and some people live in Washington State. And in between all these states, there has to be an entity that governs what happens. So that's the Interstate Commerce Clause. And actually a lot of laws that get passed in Congress kind of, again, wiggle their way in through the Interstate Commerce Clause. Because that's one of their only things that they can regulate. Believe it or not, female genital mutilation was passed saying that it had enough to do with interstate commerce. And so this judge says, it's not that I believe that we should be doing this or that this should be practiced. It's just that's bogus. Like, that doesn't have enough to do with interstate commerce. I'm striking this law down on constitutional grounds.
Right.
Now, if we had the Equal Rights Amendment, we would not need to wiggle our way in. We would not need the interstate commerce. We would have a totally new foundation from which we can pass laws specifically to protect women and girls.
Yeah. So I just want people to understand that, like, by passing the ERA, it's easier to get or to win cases based on discrimination against sex, discrimination against women. It's easier to win if we have the ERA. And if we don't have the ERA, you have to find other laws in the Constitution and set certain precedents. And so it's more difficult. And some people think that that is the way how our court system works, and it makes slow change, and it keeps sort of the checks and balances in system. But in terms of what we're talking about, we think it's really important for women to be made equal, for all sexes to be made equal and have that sort of standing constitutionally.
And we're really not ever going to get there without the Equal Rights Amendment. It's not like we're going to eventually litigate these cases till the cows come home, and in 200 years we're going to arrive at a standard that treats us as equal. That's actually not going to happen, because we can only get so far without changing the Constitution. Like this, they kind of tried to skip that step in the 1970s when we didn't win. It was like, okay, we didn't win. Let's we lost, we didn't get it ratified. Let's try all these other ways to get us into the Constitution. And that actually didn't work. Like we didn't get there. So we actually have to go back. We can't skip that step.
Great. Okay. So what can we do? We're ready to close soon, but what can can we do? Like, what if you're interested and you're listening to this and you're like, wow, this is really curious, or I've never heard about this before, or yes, of course, I believe in equality and I want to get more involved. What are things you can do? You can listen to your podcast.
Yeah.
And
I think people can do what you've done, which is really learn about the issue, especially if you're a younger person who's never heard about this. It's not your fault. I didn't know about it. The reason we haven't learned about it is because it's sort of skipped a generation, and it's really just rejuvenating now. So I would say learn as much about it as you can. You can watch Ordinary Equality. You can watch this new show, Mrs. America. You can, there's actually, for younger people, there's a group of teenagers. It's called Generation Ratify, and they're doing all kinds of super cool things. They have an entire online activism, 7 weeks of online activism for the ERA coming out. So check out there on Instagram. It was founded by a 15-year-old, and everyone in the group is under 18. It's so great. I love them. They're so on the ball. I was never like this in high school. They call me. They're like, okay, Miss Kelly, we have an agenda. You're third on the agenda. Could you present this, and this? I'll follow up with you with a draft of this. Like, they're very, very together, and incredible. I absolutely love Gen Z. So if you're a younger person and you want to get involved in the Equal Rights Amendment, I would say check out Generation Ratify. And then the other thing that you can do, really, what we're trying to do now is get rid of the deadline. So there was a deadline in 1982 for the ratification effort. And Congress right now has a bill to eliminate that deadline. So we're focused on the Senate. I would check out, if you want to know how to contact your representatives and your senators, I would go to equalitynow.org/ERA. So you can just go, what, sorry?
Writing in the comments.
Yes. equalitynow.org/ERA. And that is a way where you can write in that form, you can fill out where you live, and it'll send a message to the appropriate senator. And so that's kind of where we're focused right now, is getting that deadline eliminated and actually getting this thing into the Constitution. And then, you know what, learning about it and sharing it with other people is so vital, because it's going to be passed by people who are working on it now, but it's going to outlive everyone who's currently on the Supreme Court, everyone who's currently in Congress, both of us on this conversation. The Equal Rights Amendment is going to last, like other amendments, for hundreds of years. It's sort of this foundation that we're building now, upon which the scaffolding of women's equality is going to be constructed.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk about it now because I think it is more of a complicated issue, and it's not necessarily like a hot button issue right now, even though it is in the general conversation. But I just think it's important for people to talk about it, especially now. Like, I think I know I'm feeling kind of powerless when I see all these people suffering, and we're afraid of this like virus, and people are dying, and it's unusual times. And so I think focusing on the things that we can do, and that's things that we can pass. And once this is over, I think this time is really showing the inequality in terms of especially economic equality right now. And so I think, and in terms of healthcare workers, so if we're looking at like where, and I encourage anybody who's watching this, like if you're at home right now, where are you seeing people fall through the cracks, and like what can you do to help sort of remedy that, not just now but for the future? And this is an ongoing discussion, and don't be afraid to like ask questions, reach out, listen to podcasts, learn, reach out to your representatives. Like, it doesn't have to be a sort of like scary, complicated thing, because there are lots of scary, complicated things, but you can learn slowly about them through them.
Yeah, and you can ask them questions. Like, they represent you. If you go to a town hall, ask your representative, where do you stand on the Equal Rights Amendment? Do you know about it? What are you doing to get it ratified? So you don't ever have to feel like you have to be an expert on something in order to hold them accountable, to ask them to work on something. You can just say, what's your stance on the ERA?
Great. Perfect. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This was great. And I hope all of you can check out the podcast, Ordinary Equality. Yep. So have a great day. Stay
Thanks,
safe.
everybody.
Stay healthy. All right. Bye.
Thanks.